Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this video I'm going to be going through my method for drawing an eye realistically using graphite pencils. And so the materials that I'm using for this are going to be a 4H graphite pencil, a B grade, 3B and 6B graphite pencil, the black Faber-Castell polychromos pencil, 3 blending stumps, a kneaded eraser and also a normal eraser for some of the brighter highlights as well. And so if you guys want to see a real-time version of this complete with voiceover, then I have got that available for you guys now over on my Patreon, as well as lots of other graphite studies like the hair, lips and nose as well. So I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to check that out. But anyway guys, let's get straight onto this tutorial. So the first thing that I did was I created a really accurate sketch and I used a reference photo to do this. And what I did was I basically blocked in all of the main structures that make up the eye, like the pupil, iris, waterline, tear duct, the main creases and all of that sort of stuff. And then I went in and I also added some of the outlines for the main shadows and highlights in the iris as well. And now I'm going in and I'm starting to work on the iris. And the first thing that I did was I used the 3B pencil to block in the darkest areas, which was the pupil and kind of the outside edge of the iris. I didn't apply a lot of pressure to the pencil, I just kept it very light, and I also made sure that my pencil was really sharp. And so once I've built up all of the shadows and I got the outside edge of the iris as dark as I needed it to be by just layering and using my pencil in all of the different angles to get into the white grain of the paper, which gives it a darker look, I then went in and I just added a light layer to the rest of the iris. I didn't apply much pencil to where the highlighted areas was to start with. I wanted to keep them quite light. And now what I'm doing is I'm going in with the 6B pencil just to darken up those shadows even more. So I want to get a base layer down on this iris and I want to know where the darkest shadows are and the lightest ones. And so what I'm doing now is I'm going in with that blending stump. I'm making sure that it's a clean blending stump and I'm just lightly using that over the whole of the iris just to soften up those pencil strokes so that it doesn't look grainy. And then once I've done that, I go back in with the 6B pencil to again add another layer of graphite and darken up the main shadows. So I'm adding that to the pupil and the outside edge of the iris. And I also go and I make some unique sort of lines for the unique flecks in the iris as well. And I'm doing this in lines rather than lots of circular motions, because if you look at the iris, the sort of flecks and the pattern of the iris does look very sort of liney in terms of lines rather than like little circles. So I thought it was really fitting to use line pencil strokes that go from the outside edge of the iris towards the middle. And now what I'm doing to kind of create an even darker look is I'm just going in with the black Faber-Castell polychromos pencil and I'm just using that to darken up the main darkest parts, so the really dark parts, which is the pupil and just a bit of the outside edge of that iris. And I kept blending with that blending stump in between those layers to keep making sure that it was really soft. And as you see, even though we didn't apply lots of graphite to those highlighted areas at the start, when you blend it with the blending stump, it adds the value to those highlighted areas so they're not really white. And now what I'm doing is I'm going in with that kneaded eraser just to pull up some of those main highlights. If they're too bright, you can go in with the blending stump and glaze some graphite over those highlights just to tone them down a bit. And then I go in again with that eraser just to really brighten up those main highlights. Sometimes it's really good to use your eraser to create little patterns and then go over it with the blending stump, and this will create kind of depth because you've got lots of different highlights and shadows going on. You want a variety of values in your iris. And so once I've done the iris, I'm going into the white of the eye. And a common mistake that people make when they're shading in the white of the eye is they don't do enough grey shading. They leave it quite white and just do a tiny bit of shading. When in reality, if you look at the white of the eye on most reference photos, the value can get pretty dark. It can be pretty grey. So make sure that you really look at the values for the white of the eye instead of just assuming that it's going to be quite light, because this white of the eye was actually pretty dark. So I went in with the B grade pencil first and I lightly layered a layer all over that white of the eye, and then I built up even more shadow on the darkest parts with that 3B and on the tear duct. And now I'm going in and I'm just blending that all out with, again, a clean blending stump. And I applied even more shadows to the tear ducts, but again, I didn't apply a lot of graphite to the highlighted areas in the tear duct, so that I could tell where they were going to be, where the highlights were. And once I blended that out with the blending stump, I just continue to use that 6B pencil and the 3B pencil to just build up those shadows, and I'm blending with the blending stump in between. And you can see just how smooth this looks, and also it does look really dark. And it looks dark in comparison to the white background, but once you add everything in, it actually looks pretty light. And then what I did was I added a bit of detail. So if you want to make it look more detailed, look at the little veins that are created on the white of the eye and try to include those details as well, and this will really help your eye to look realistic. And so now what I'm doing is I'm working on the crease above the eye, and so I'm going in with that B grade pencil and I'm just lightly layering the pencil all over that skin area, and I'm using the side of the pencil because this helps to get a really even coverage. And again, I'm not applying a lot of pressure at all throughout this process. I don't really apply a lot of pressure. I just build it up in light layers. And so it doesn't really matter if it looks too sort of messy now. Once you blend it out, it gets really, really smooth. As long as you're not applying a lot of pressure, you won't get stubborn pencil strokes showing through. If you was to press hard on the pencil, then it will be harder to blend out those pencil strokes and it might not be as smooth. And so now I'm going in with that blending stump and I'm just blending everything out, and then I'll go over the top with more graphite pencils. So the 3B now instead of the B, just a darker pencil, and I'm just working on building up those shadows to the desired level. And so the crease is normally the darkest sort of part on that skin. It can get pretty dark, and the darker it kind of gets, the more sort of depth it will have. It will look more sort of like a deep crease rather than just a shallow crease. And so look at the skin, try and pick out where are the darkest parts. And once I went and I built up the shadows to where they needed to be, I'm going in with a kneaded eraser just to pull up the highlights, like on part of that waterline and also just little parts on the upper eyelid as well. And also to create some little creases, it's really important to create a bit of texture in your skin, especially if it is quite textured skin. It might not always be super smooth, so there might be a bit of texture that you'll need to sort of replicate. And now I'm going to repeat that process for the whole of the rest of the skin. So I'm going in with that B grade pencil again, and I'm just layering down that pencil onto the whole of the skin around the eye. Again, it doesn't really matter if it gets a bit messy, that's completely fine. It will blend out really smooth. If you don't have a blending stump, then a few other things that I recommend to blend with are tissue. That's a really good cheap substitute for getting smooth graphite shading, and also cotton buds. They are really, really good at getting smooth shading as well. So I am continuing to use that B grade pencil and also the 3B for some of the darker areas. And again, I'm going in with that blending stump and I'm just blending that out till it's smooth. One tip I have for you guys if you're using blending stumps is to avoid going back and forth, otherwise you'll get these stop and start points. What you need to do is sweep your sort of blending stump from one area across to the other without sort of stopping and going back and forth, and this will help get really smooth shading. So now I'm going in with another layer. I'm using the 3B and the 6B pencil this time because I'm working on getting the shadows even darker. So I just keep adding that graphite and blending in between. I blend between each layer so that it's really, really smooth. And so I'm focusing on the shadows on the inner corner of the eye and also on the outer edge as well. And again, even though I'm trying to get it darker, I'm not applying any more pressure than before. I'm just using those darker grade pencils. So now I'm moving on to working on the eyebrow, and I'm blocking in very lightly where the hairs are going to be. And so it's really important to look at the direction that the eyebrow hairs are going in when you're trying to get them blocked in. And remember, to make it look realistic, you don't have to draw every single eyebrow hair. Just look at the general direction and look for where are there sort of the most eyebrow hairs throughout that eyebrow, where are the most sort of dense places, and it's normally on that inner corner of the eyebrow, and it usually gets a bit more sparse towards the end. And also higher up you have these sort of hairs fading down from the skin into the eyebrow, sort of meeting into the middle of the eyebrow. So I focus more of the darker shading on those sort of fuller parts of the eyebrow, and I just layer and layer more hairs until it gets a really nice realistic look. And I'm also using that Faber-Castell black pencil to get it really, really dark. In reality, the eyebrow was much darker in real life, but the shine from the lights is kind of making it look lighter than it is. So if you use that black Faber-Castell polychromos, it will get it really nice and dark for you, just like it did with the pupil. So now I've finished with the eyebrow, I'm going to move on to adding some little details to the texture in the skin. And so this reference photo had a few little creases under the eye, and so it's important to get that texture in. So I'm just going in with the B grade graphite pencil and I'm just blocking in where some of those creases are. I'm not copying the reference photo exactly, they don't need to be exactly the same. I'm just looking for the general direction and placement of the creases, but it doesn't necessarily matter if you get every single crease and all those tiny little details exactly the same as the reference photo. Just look at the sort of direction and how they overlap together. And I'm also working on tweaking the shadows around the rest of the skin just to make sure that my contrast is accurate. It's really important to make sure that you've got your shadows dark enough and your highlighted areas bright enough to really make that pop. And a good way of telling if your contrast is good is to take a photo and, like, in your photo sort of like gallery on your phone, the little thumbnail of it, see if it really catches your eye. Does it look realistic? Does it really pop and capture your attention? If it doesn't, it's most likely that you need to sort of hype up that contrast. And so what I'm doing now is I'm really hyping up that contrast by going through with that black Faber-Castell polychromos, and I added the shadows to the creases and the eyebrows, and I'm also using erasers to pull up the highlights and make them even brighter. So I'm adding some of the highlights for the creases and that texture under the eye as well. And also just to sort of revive some of the highlights we did earlier. And I'm also adding some highlights with the kneaded eraser and lightening some of the skin. So like just above the eye but below the eyebrow, there's that nice highlight. So I wanted to make sure that I've got that in to make it look three-dimensional as well. And another thing that I wanted to do was use a really tiny piece of eraser and just use that to create some brighter little eyebrow hairs under the eyebrow, because there was some of these stray lighter eyebrow hairs, so it's important that you get in all of those details as well. But at the moment they are looking quite harsh, so I will be toning them down a bit later to make them more subtle, because you don't want them really bright. And now let's get started on the eyelashes. So the first thing that I did was I took a 3B graphite pencil and I just used this to block in the general sort of direction and placement of the eyelash hairs. So it's really important to look at your reference photo and get the general gist of how the eyelash hairs are sort of curved and what direction they're going in. It's really important to look at that sort of stuff, and also look at where are the eyelashes thicker and where are they sparser, and that's really important to make it look realistic. And so once I've blocked in all of those eyelashes, I go in with the black Faber-Castell polychromos pencil and I just use that to darken up and thicken up those eyelashes. I thicken up the roots of the eyelashes and I leave it a bit thinner at the end to create that sort of volume to them and to make them look realistic. They're not the same thickness all the way across, so it's really important to look at those details. And I'm finally just adjusting the details. Now that I've got everything blocked in, I'm just going to look at each area and see what I need to tweak. As I said, you can tell that once I've got everything blocked in, the white of the eye actually does look pretty bright. So I just wanted to darken that up a bit, as well as the iris. I wanted to darken up the iris, make it look more shadowed. In the reference photo, it wasn't as bright as it is now, so I really wanted to tone it down to make it more realistic. And so I'm just using that black Faber-Castell polychromos just to really darken everything up. And so now I'm going in with a tissue, and like I said, I just wanted to tone down those little white hairs, so I just went over that with a clean tissue, and it really softens out that look and makes it look a lot better and a lot more subtle. And like I said, tissue can be used as well to just blend out any areas in general and soften it up. But you have got to keep in mind that it does lighten up the graphite as well, because it kind of pulls some of the graphite off of the page. So now I'm just tweaking things. I really want to darken up those shadows. As you can see, I darkened up the iris and I made that look a lot more sort of toned down. I didn't want the contrast between the darkest shadows and the highlights to be quite so much, so I really toned that down. And I also worked on adding some more detail to the creases. If you guys want a list of the materials that I used for this, then I have listed them all in the description below so you can see what I'm using and where you can get it from as well. So I also added some little veins again in the white of the eye. I just wanted to make them a little bit darker and stand out a little bit more. And so now I'm really darkening up that iris. I wanted to make the darker shadow on the outside bit of the iris a bit thicker, so it was just a bit too thin. And now I'm just basically adding some of that black Faber-Castell polychromos over the whole of the iris, and I'm just blending that out, and I blend it across the whole of the iris to kind of soften the highlights, make them not as bright, and really tone everything down and smooth it out. And I'm also just going in with that blending stump just to add a bit of shadow anywhere where it needs to be. By the way guys, I'd love to know what other tutorials do you want to see? Do you want to see more graphite tutorials? I have also got a graphite tutorial on how to draw a realistic nose and a realistic mouth coming up. So make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss out on that. But let me know, what other tutorials do you want to see? Do you want to see more colored pencil tutorials, more graphite tutorials? I am always going to be doing a mixture of all of them. I'm never going to just kind of stick to one type. But what would you like to see more on? Or is there anything in particular that you want a tutorial on? Like, is there a certain part of this that you want to see a more detailed tutorial on? And I will create that for you guys. But just let me know all of your suggestions. I would be really happy to read them and to create them for you guys. So again, I'm just adjusting things. I really want to make sure that it's really nice and accurate. But that's basically it for this tutorial. Like I said, I have got this as well as lips, nose and hair tutorials on my Patreon, so you can check that out. I'll leave a link in the description. But anyway guys, that is it for this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you're new around here, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more tutorials, and I'll see you next time. Bye everybody.